Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. For both January and February of this year, I've made videos talking about 8 books scheduled for publication that particular month. And I assumed I would do the same thing for March. But I looked at my list of March books and realized that there were so many great books coming out this month that there was no way I could narrow it down to 8 choices. So I divided up the month. Today, I'll be talking about the books coming out in the latter half of the month, starting with a few that are already on bookshelf shelves. Before I begin, I'll say what I always say, that this is a very idiosyncratic list based only on my own quirky obsessions and personal tastes. In other words, this is in no way exhaustive of all that is coming out. The first book I want to mention is My Oceans, Essays of Water, Whales, and Women by Christina Rivera. I've said before that almost all books in the American market are released on Tuesdays. This book is one of the exceptions, released on a Saturday, March 15th, by Northwestern University Press. It makes some sense to me that a university press might feel less bound by the commercial publishing's strong tradition of Tuesday releases. At any rate, from the description, this book sounds really wonderful and is on my reading list for the 3-hour train ride I'll be taking soon. The publisher's description starts out talking about form, saying that the author talks about ecology in a, quote, swell of sea-linked essays. The author braids memoir with both nature writing and climate science, and in the process, she finds herself talking about grief, especially the collective grief that we face as climate change and other ecological disasters affect humans, non-human species, and the planet overall. She talks about, as the pubnote says, a grieving orca, a hunted manta ray, a pregnant sea turtle, a spawning salmon, etc. I've been thinking a lot lately about the kinds of books I want to read when I am in need of comfort. And I think I often lean into books that are quiet and gentle, and at the same time are both heartbreaking and informative, and maybe even angry. This book seems to be written very much in that vein, in ways that sound like they might appeal to readers of Rachel Carson. Combining essays, often about new life, with her own experience of motherhood, Rivera writes about what the blurb calls the Earth's blue womb. Sometimes language like this makes me wonder if a book will be poetic or if it will just be too sentimental, but the larger description makes it clear that this is a book full of analysis and deep thoughtfulness, and I'm really looking forward to it. Okay, the next set of books all came out on the 18th, Tuesday of this week. I'll start with Firstborn, a memoir by Lauren Christensen. Here, the author writes that when she was in her early 30s and had partnered with a person she loved, she became pregnant. Partly because she had been raised by fairly distant parents, she and her partner thought quite consciously about how they wanted to parent. And then she found out that the very much wanted child she was carrying was dying in her womb. That is, it had complications incompatible with life. The child would not live even if she carried it to term, but if she did, she would be endangering her own life as well. While I think the book is most significantly about the experience of this particular kind of grief, it does, of course, have to address what the pub sheet calls, quote, the brutal limits of maternal health care right now. Another release I'm very eager to read and will probably save until September for my participation in Framed, the art readathon, is a new biography by Blake Gopnik, the Mavericks Museum, Albert Barnes and his American Dream. Albert Barnes, the man who created the Barnes art collection, had a very different approach from most of the people who were involved in the creation of museums. I've talked a bit about his approach in a video, and in fact I made a vlog of my visit to the museum last year. I'll link to those videos down in the description box. But here's a quick summary. Although Barnes was not raised in an aristocratic family, after making a fortune in medical development, he invested in art. And he was interested in the work of artists like Renoir and Cézanne and Matisse and Picasso, etc., artists who were not yet being actively collected for display in the world's largest art museums. He was interested not in sharing these works with well-heeled art lovers, but instead with the working class people that he grew up with, people who did not necessarily have much experience with or knowledge of art history. He was more interested in focusing on the actual use of imagery and symbols, etc., instead of placing the art into historical movements. This book shows that Barnes, who lived during the progressive movement in the United States, was active in reshaping American society in ways somewhat adjacent to the activism that other progressives were engaged in. He wanted to democratize the nation's aesthetic life, or, as the pub sheet says, taking art out of the hands of the elite and making it available to the average American. Okay, the next book I'll mention is also an art book that I'll be saving for September's Framed, BookTube's Art Readathon. It's titled The Twilight of Bohemia, Westbeth, and the Last Artist of New York by Peter Trachtenberg. In 1970, artists and their families could get affordable housing at Westbeth Artist Housing, a location in what was then a relatively undesirable area of New York City. The collective filled an entire city block and housed everyone from the photographer Diane Arbus to musician Phil Evans. The pub sheet says that Westbeth served as a, quote, great society for Bohemians, great society in capital letters as it was used by President Johnson in the 1960s, and explains that offering artists basically a middle-class lifestyle at affordable rents, quote, freed them to walk along the cliff edge of their art. Over time, the neighborhood not surprisingly gentrified, and it's now called the Meatpacking District, where the average apartment rents for more than $6,000 a month. But the Westbeth Art Society continues, now with almost all of the residents over the age of 60, making it, as the pub sheet points out, an arty senior center in a way. The book is interested in playing out whether Westbeth is a holdout fighting against late-stage capitalism. And it also asks if art can still be part of that fight, or if, quote, art making is a relic of a past way of life. Honestly, this book sounds right up my alley, a cross between art history and urban social history. This book is published by Godine, a fairly small publisher who puts out really beautiful books. This particular volume comes with a tremendous amount of advanced praise. Francine Prose calling it a page-turner. Artist Eileen Miles pointing out that it is about a completely original enclave for artists. And Philip Lapade calling it magnificently researched and written with verve, wit, and compassion. The next book I want to bring to your attention is called Wages for Housework, The Feminist Fight Against Unpaid Labor by Emily Callaci, whose name I'm not sure I'm pronouncing correctly. This is the story of an international group of activists in the 1970s who fought for wages for people who did unpaid care work across the world, very frequently women. They're contributing $9 trillion to the global economy each year. And as the pub sheet says, dinner is not magically made and children must be cared for. And then it goes on, why is this work not compensated? The author is interested in exploring the activists' belief that paying people for their work at home could be a revolutionary act, transforming the potential future of not just women's lives, but of capitalism. I'm quite intrigued by this book. I learned about this movement from an activist, actually my young yoga teacher at the time, who was active in the political fight for this in the very early 1990s. The idea kind of shocked me at the time, and it wasn't something I had ever considered before. If both adults in a two-person household work full-time, especially when full-time now often means something much closer to 60 or more hours per week for a lot of professionals, who does the household chores, from cleaning the bathrooms and doing the laundry to cooking and taking care of any children? I'm not convinced that paying one spouse to do that work while the other works outside the home is a great solution, especially if the person who becomes the main paid caretaker is almost always the woman. And it's doubly problematic when the assumption by the movement is also that the housekeeper will be the woman. That could actually put opportunities for women in general in jeopardy, as I see it. But I'm fascinated to read this book, which combines a kind of feminism with what I think a lot of us might fear as a reinforcement of traditional gender roles. I am sure as I read this book and learn more about the movement, I'll have a more nuanced understanding. Coming up today from Cambridge University Press is Living with Jane Austen by Janet Todd. I believe this is the 250th birthday of Austen this year. Is that right? As you already know from one of the earlier books featured in this video, I often love narratives that braid together memoir and a more academic discussion. And this is one of them. Todd talks about how she has read and learned from Jane Austen's novels over the course of her life. And actually, there was a book a few years ago, which I think I wrote about for Open Letters Review, that did something similar, talking about how reading Austen saw the author through some pretty intense moments in her life, including grief and mourning. That book, Austen Years by Rachel Cohen, was deeply introspective, and it was one of my favorite books from the first year of the pandemic. Todd's book appears to be much less introspective and much more focused on what readers, just in general, can learn from reading Austen. As the pub sheet says, Todd celebrates the undimmable power of Austen's work to help us understand our own bodies and our environment and teach us about patience, humor, beauty, and the meaning of home. To be honest, I find this description less than interesting. But I'm definitely going to give the book a read, probably during the BookTube event Jane Austen July. And I'm certainly buoyed by the wonderful advance praise the book has already received. Miriam Margulies calls it gentle and witty, two words that definitely both work for me. The literary biographer Richard Cronin calls the author of the very best of readers of Austen. And Jane Austen scholar Devuni Lucer says this: a timely, moving, and masterful book by one of the English-speaking world's foremost literary historians and a trailblazing scholar heroine in Jane Austen's studies. I gather that despite the almost flippant pub sheet description, the book is quite serious, almost academic in nature in places, drawing links between the novels, pointing out how particular repeating imagery enhances the plots, discussing the tropes Austen uses throughout, and considering the various themes like illness or nature that are presented in her work. It sounds like this will be an approachable and interesting book. Coming out on March 25th is Good Soil, The Education of an Accidental Farmhand by Jeff Chu. This, too, is a memoir that touches on material much broader than just the author's personal experiences. Here, Chu leaves his job as a magazine writer to contribute his labor to a working farm run by Princeton University's Theological Seminary. The goal of the project is to learn to, quote, cultivate the earth while examining life's biggest questions. That should tip you off to the fact that the title Good Soil is to be read in two ways, both literally and figuratively. Lately, there have been really a whole crop of books, I guess I can say, that talk about nature and about soil cultivation in ways that are both metaphorical and quite real. You've heard me talk about the amazing works of Margaret Rinkle, and this book has some things in common with it, it seems. I poked around just a little bit in this one so far, and I find the prose to be just lovely. While explaining where the food we eat each day comes from, what its roots are, so to speak, the author tells us about worm compost, how farm shares decide what goes in the boxes each week, etc. And it's all told in plain but poetic language. Those words are not always put together, plain and poetic, but I think it'll make sense to you when you read Chu's book. It seems very grounded, in other words. As I said, Chu has chosen to attend a seminary, and this is a book that at its heart is about faith, specifically his Christian faith. If you are a Christian, you may find that an enormous draw. From everything I can tell, if you are not a Christian, and I'm not, it also sounds like a book that will be very resonant, talking very organically about his reflections on kindness and vulnerability and how we tend to our gardens. One last book, also a book about nature and climate, is one I'm very much looking forward to reading. I suppose this particular March is a wonderful time for this general topic, as spring begins to emerge, and at the same time, when many of us are worrying about how this country's current administration might respond to the climate crisis and how it might contribute to it. This last book is called The Lost Trees of Willow Avenue, a story of climate and hope on one American street, by the author Mike Tidwell. As I've said, this particular kind of narrative about nature and climate is always a draw for me, but in this case, it's more personal. Willow Avenue, the location mentioned in the title, is my neighborhood, and I walk along that street several times a week. The author of this book, Mike Tidwell, has long been an activist here in town. A couple of years ago, he decided to chronicle the impacts of climate change on his street, one urban block, as the Pup Street emphasizes, right on the border of Washington, D.C. He talks about the oaks dying of heat waves and overwhelming rainstorms, and how many people have suddenly been diagnosed with Lyme disease here, about solar panels and basement floods that are both features at a local church. He celebrates his neighbors who are trying to combat the climate crisis, from a midwife creating a geothermal energy arrangement to a congressman who not only lost his son to suicide, stood up to the January 6th riots at the Capitol, received treatment for cancer, and has continued to fight climate change in the halls of government. I want to read a conclusion from the pub sheet that I think makes it clear why this book matters. Quote, "No book has told the story of climate change this way, hyper-local, full of surprises, full of true stories of life and death in one neighborhood. The Lost Trees of Willow Avenue is a harrowing and hopeful proxy for every street in America and every place on Earth." All right, that will do it for this list. I assume I will be making a similar list, or lists, for books that are forthcoming in April, which I will try to get out right before the start of the new month. Happy reading to all of you. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.